They fired me the day I saved them $12 million. Not metaphorically saved. Literally prevented a federal lawsuit that would have bankrupted 3 departments and sent our CFO to prison. The vendor contract I'd flagged that morning contained SEC violations so blatant they might as well have been written in neon. But Kyle Brennan didn't want to hear about problems. He wanted signatures and speed, so naturally he fired the guy who actually read the contracts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then they called me the contract architect. Some said it with respect. Others rolled their eyes like I was the hall monitor of legal. Always there, always unnoticed, always somehow holding the place together. My official title was Senior Contracts Manager. 16 years deep at TechFlow Solutions. 13 years away from retirement. With 2 kids in college and a mortgage that required both my salary and my sanity. I didn't make noise. I made airtight agreements. I didn't play foosball in the break room or network during innovation retreats. I lived in the fine print. While other people flirted with disaster, I was threading liability needles like my kids' college tuition depended on it. Which it did. Give me a red pen, a 30-page draft from sales, and a cup of burnt office coffee, and I was happier than a retriever with a tennis ball. I loved it. Really loved it. And yeah, if you've made it this far and you're one of the 90% of folks who listen to stories like this while checking emails or making dinner, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Not for me, I've got my legal situation sorted. But the team behind this, they read every click like oxygen. Helps keep the stories coming. Anyway, at work, I was the gray suit in a room full of startup hoodies. Never flashy, never messy, just there. Dependable. I kept things legal, compliant, and quiet. 2 things nobody in our office appreciated until everything started burning. Kyle sure didn't appreciate it. Kyle Brennan, the new COO. 34 years old with a Stanford MBA and the kind of startup swagger that made experienced employees invisible. He didn't just dislike legacy staff. He saw us as obstacles to innovation. Within his first week, he'd started bypassing legal review on time-sensitive deals and creating fast-track approval processes that somehow never included the contracts department. I was legacy. That made me a threat. Not in the sword-fighting sense, but in the I know what you're doing and why it'll explode kind of way. Kyle didn't want guardrails. He wanted yes men. He wanted to sign things fast, flip partnerships like pancakes, and get quoted in TechCrunch before the 4th quarter. Me, I wanted to read the vendor clause that waived our rights to sue in case of IP theft. Call me old-fashioned. Before Kyle showed up, life was weirdly peaceful. I'd start my day with burnt coffee and a spreadsheet of open contracts. I liked the solitude of it, how every clause was a puzzle. Every deal was a minefield I could diffuse with the right indemnity language. I spent years building a system where even if everyone around me lost their minds, the contracts wouldn't. I was the seatbelt in a car full of speed freaks. They didn't like that I pulled the emergency brake sometimes, but they were still alive because of it. People forget that in companies like ours, the person who writes the rules quietly becomes the most dangerous person in the building. They just don't realize it until it's too late. He blew in with a Stanford MBA and the kind of confidence that makes board members nod along while experienced employees become invisible. First day, he parked in the CEO's spot and announced to the entire office that we needed to move at startup velocity. Translation: cut the legal review, skip the risk assessment, and pray nothing explodes. He was charming in that fast-talking, spin you around and sign your house away kind of way. Had that fake, humble charisma that made interns swoon and board members nod. The kind of guy who ended every sentence with "makes sense," like your understanding was part of his genius. He didn't just disregard legacy staff. He treated us like expired milk. The second he found out I'd been there over a decade, he smiled like I'd just confessed to still using dial-up. "I like fresh eyes," he said once, teeth gleaming. "People who think differently." Which of course meant people who don't remember how we got sued in 2017 for this exact stunt. Within weeks, he'd started muscling through contracts like they were Tinder swipes. Sales loved him. Product worshipped him. And legal was being left out of calls, pushed out of deal memos, and sent final drafts 2 minutes before signatures. It was like watching someone build a skyscraper without checking the foundation, using fireworks instead of concrete. I wasn't panicking yet. 16 years had taught me that companies go through phases. Bad managers come and go. Good contracts outlast them all. I kept doing my job, reading every line, flagging every risk, sending my careful memos up the chain. But Kyle wasn't just ignoring the warnings. He was actively bypassing the system, removing people from email threads, creating fast-track approval processes that somehow never included me, setting up side conversations with vendors before contracts even hit my desk. The guy was allergic to process, and in the contracts world, process isn't bureaucracy. It's survival. That's when I knew this wasn't going to end with Kyle learning his lesson or the board reining him in. This was going to end with someone getting hurt. The question was whether it would be me, the company, or both. Turns out I'd spent years building the perfect trap. I just didn't know Kyle would be stupid enough to step in it. Then came the breach point. A vendor contract landed on my desk. Retroactively, of course. Kyle's new favorite trick was getting signatures first, then sending me the FYI version afterward. This one didn't just raise red flags. It raised air raid sirens. On paper, it looked like a dream. Strategic licensing partnership with a tech firm in Vancouver. Clean revenue split, reasonable terms. The kind of deal that makes quarterly reports look pretty. But buried in the boilerplate was a clause that outright violated our NDA with a major financial partner and could trigger mandatory disclosures under SEC Rule 10b-5. That's not just bad. That's federal court bad. I flagged it carefully. Professionally. Sent a memo up through legal, copied compliance, even tagged our usual risk consultant. I didn't shout, didn't make it political, just outlined the liability like I'd done 1,000 times before. 2 hours later, I was summoned to Kyle's office. Let me rephrase. I was summoned to his glass fishbowl throne room, where he liked holding impromptu meetings like a reality show villain. The guy was practically allergic to doors. I walked in, closed my folder, and sat down. He didn't offer a seat. Just leaned against his standing desk, sipping something green and awful from a branded company tumbler. "You don't like the deal?" he said without looking at me. "It violates 3 standing agreements and would require disclosure to the SEC. We could be..." He held up a finger like he was silencing a child. "Warren," he said my name slowly, deliberately. "You've been here, 15 years? That's exactly the problem. You see obstacles where I see opportunities. This deal moves us forward. Your job is to make the paperwork work, not to second-guess strategy." The dismissal was calculated. Professional, dangerous. "The SEC disclosure isn't optional," I said. "It's federal law." Kyle leaned back, studying me like I was a broken piece of equipment. "We need people who solve problems, not create them. Legal archaeology might have worked in the old days, but we're building the future here. Stay in your lane and let the grown-ups handle strategy." I could have exploded. Could have pulled out the documentation, dropped receipts like a courtroom drama. But I didn't. I nodded. Just a small, deliberate nod. Because in that moment, I knew something Kyle didn't. He thought he was flying a rocket ship, but I'd spent the last 16 years quietly building the escape hatch. And he'd just strapped himself in. I spent that night staring at the ceiling fan, replaying his words like crime scene footage. Stay in your lane. Legal archaeology. No one reads the fine print. My jaw hurt from clenching. Not because he insulted me, that part was expected, but because I knew what he was about to unleash on the company. And the board had no clue. I wasn't just thinking about my job. I was thinking about the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that were going to rip through this place like a chainsaw in a bouncy house. My mortgage, my kids' tuition bills. 13 years until retirement, and this guy was about to torch the whole operation. So I followed protocol, because I am protocol. First, I drafted a compliance summary outlining the violations in that vendor contract, cited every clause, every SEC disclosure risk, cross-referenced it with prior precedent. No emotion, no opinions, just pure risk analysis. Then I escalated it, copying legal compliance, even our internal risk management officer. Quietly, I didn't go full sirens blaring. I let the facts speak, and then I waited. 2 days passed. Radio silence. On the 3rd day, I got an invite. Subject line, contract alignment touchpoint. Harmless, boring. Kyle's executive assistant sent it like it was any other alignment meeting, except it was scheduled in the main conference room. The one with all the glass. The one usually reserved for investor pitches and product launches. There were already people inside when I walked in. Kyle, obviously arms folded like a prosecutor. 3 department heads avoiding eye contact. And company lawyer Rachel Martinez, flipping through a manila folder, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. I stepped in. No handshake, no chair offered. Kyle didn't even wait for the door to close. "We're terminating your employment," he said like he was reading quarterly numbers. "Effective immediately. For breach of trust." "Breach of what?" I said, genuinely confused. "You went outside your scope. You escalated confidential deal information. You're not a compliance officer. You're not an attorney. You abused internal channels to undermine executive decisions. I could feel every eye in the room trying to look anywhere else. Rachel's hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the folder. Then Kyle reached in and yanked out a copy of my NDA, slapped it down like evidence in a murder trial. This agreement includes confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions. Any discussion of internal matters outside approved channels constitutes a violation with personal financial liability. His smile was cold, calculated. He thought he'd just ended my career and my financial future in the same breath. That's when I saw it. Not the NDA Kyle had, mine. The one I'd written years ago, back when our then general counsel asked me to revise our standard contract for legal staff and senior contract managers. We were dealing with sensitive regulatory issues, and he wanted anyone raising red flags to be shielded. That was paragraph 12B. I pulled a copy from my folder. Not the one Kyle had, but mine. Highlighted in yellow, years of revision notes in the margins. I slid it slowly across the glass table toward Rachel. My finger tapped exactly where it mattered. Paragraph 12B. Indemnity clause. In the event of termination coinciding with documented regulatory concern or protected compliance escalation, the company agrees to assume full legal liability and defense costs related to said termination, in perpetuity with no cap. Rachel froze. You could see the exact moment it clicked. Her face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. She understood what she was looking at before Kyle did. Kyle was still clueless. He'd just triggered a legal mechanism he didn't even know existed. So I turned to him, voice steady as bedrock, and said, "I didn't breach trust, Kyle. I followed protocol. And now you've breached indemnity." He looked at Rachel for support. She couldn't meet his eyes. The folder in her hands might as well have been a ticking bomb. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for a cardboard box or make a speech about justice. I just stood up, one foot in front of the other, and walked out of that glass fishbowl while Rachel sat there holding a document that would cost the company more than Kyle's entire salary. I didn't slam doors. I didn't cry in the elevator. I didn't pull a dramatic scene and scream about injustice in front of the break room. I walked out like I was going to lunch, calm as a hospice nurse, heels clicking against the laminate like a slow metronome. There's a power in silence that loud men never understand. Security didn't even escort me. That was their first mistake. Back at my desk, I slid my chair in, unplugged my mouse, and opened my laptop. My device. Company issued, but personally assigned and legally accessible under my termination clause. I synced my Outlook to local storage, pulled every flagged memo I'd ever sent regarding contract violations, SEC risks, internal NDA breaches, and questionable revenue smoothing language buried in third-party agreements. I wasn't stealing secrets. I was recovering the receipts of my own work. 16 years of audits, red lines, and escalation emails. All time-stamped, all traceable, all sent through company channels. I didn't need screenshots. I had metadata. Then I shut the lid, walked out, and gave my badge to the guy at the front desk with a smile that probably haunted him for weeks. By the time I got home, my inbox was already filling with pings from ex-colleagues. The whispers had started. "Why did Kyle look so nervous when you left?" Rachel looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Did you write that NDA clause?" I didn't respond. Let them stew. Instead, I made coffee, powered up my desktop, and spent the next 6 hours organizing my archive. I created folders: indemnity, ignored escalations, risk-flagged contracts, SEC violations suspected, and Kyle timeline. I cross-referenced contract timestamps with email alerts. Every time I'd raised a concern about shady vendor clauses or misrepresented partnership structures, I linked it to the contract language Kyle had fast-tracked. It was like mapping a crime scene with highlighters, and the pattern was disgusting. Kyle hadn't just ignored warnings. He'd deleted people from threads, bypassed legal, and shoved contracts through under fabricated urgency. We'll lose the deal. This is how startups move. Don't be the bottleneck. But the worst part? Rachel had seen it all. Maybe not every email, but enough. She'd been looped in. She'd signed off. Her initials were on files where the risk section was conveniently blank. I wasn't just going up against a bad COO. I was going up against a bad system that had finally started eating itself. The next morning, I got a cease and desist email. Well, technically it came from HR, but the language screamed Kyle. It said my behavior post-termination may constitute a violation of my NDA and demanded I cease any communication regarding internal company matters to outside parties. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. Then I flagged the email, dropped it into the folder titled Retaliation, and made a note. Attempted suppression of whistleblower protections confirmed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The indemnity clause had already activated. Their attempt to scare me into silence only built my case. From what I heard later, the panic started 3 days after I left. Legal called an emergency meeting. Rachel didn't show. Kyle started snapping at people in hallways. The board sent a routine inquiry about pending contracts. People started asking why the entire new vendor pipeline was frozen. And somewhere in the background, my attorney was sharpening her pen. Her name was Patricia Kane, and she didn't smile unless it was to bare teeth. Employment litigator by trade, velociraptor by temperament. 3 years ago, I'd recommended her to our former general counsel when a VP tried to claim a junior staffer misunderstood what a closed-door meeting meant. She'd settled the case so fast it made HR dizzy, and the VP was gone within a week. Patricia specialized in corporate retaliation cases, had a reputation for turning bad terminations into career-ending lawsuits for executives. That's who I called. Patricia, I said, it's time. She didn't need details. She remembered me, remembered the clause, remembered that I'd written my own insurance policy years ago. We met at her office the next morning in a conference room colder than Kyle's ambition. I laid everything out in front of her. Email archive, flagged memos, contract discrepancies, the cease and desist. Her eyes moved across each page like a surgeon examining x-rays, looking for the exact point of failure. 15 minutes in, she held up a hand and said, "Stop talking. You've already won. Now we make them understand exactly how much this is going to cost them." Together we drafted a pre-litigation letter that read like a surgical strike. Paragraph 1, Clause 12b verbatim, the indemnity trigger, the whistleblower alignment, the fact that they were now legally obligated to pay for my legal fees, their legal fees, and any damages, civil or criminal, with no financial cap and no time limit. Paragraph 2, systematic documentation of retaliation, termination following protected escalation, cease and desist attempts as intimidation, SEC-level exposure with federal implications. Paragraph 3, a professional invitation to settle this quietly before federal regulators became involved. We didn't send it to HR. We didn't send it to Kyle. We sent it to outside counsel, the firm representing the board. Because here's the thing about Kyle. He played checkers loudly, slamming pieces, declaring victory before the board was even set. I played chess, and the queen had finally come off the back line. But I didn't stop there. That same day, I made a personal call. Well, a casual industry update, as we used to call it in legal. I rang up Greg Sullivan, a regulatory auditor I'd worked with on a prior third-party review. Sharp, ethical, and just nosy enough to be useful. "Hey, Greg," I said. "Quick question. What's the threshold, again, for a company needing to self-report contract violations related to SEC-covered partnerships?" There was a pause. He knew what I was doing. "I'd check Form 8K, he said slowly. "And maybe if I were you, send me something informal. I'll decide if it warrants follow-up." I sent him a neatly collated PDF packet within the hour. No accusations, just observations, footnotes, flags. Kyle, meanwhile, still hadn't flinched. From what I heard, he thought the cease and desist had scared me off. Told the product team I was emotionally unstable. Yes. Smirked in a strategy call when someone mentioned legal being overwhelmed, said the board backed his vision. Then, Patricia's letter arrived on the desk of the board's legal representative. It was like dropping a dead bird on a dinner plate. Within 48 hours, our old outside counsel, heavy-hitting white shoe firm with an allergy to bad PR, reached out to Kyle. Not with questions, with silence, deliberate silence, the kind that fills a room like smoke before a fire alarm. Because the moment the board's lawyers confirmed 12B was real and enforceable, and that all my communications were documented, traceable, and backed by regulatory precedent, Kyle became a liability. They didn't call me. They didn't need to. Patricia got the message first. "We are reviewing the matter internally. Please refrain from formal escalation until we've had time to assess." Translation, we believe you. We are terrified. Please give us a minute to deal with our idiot problem. I didn't pop champagne. I didn't gloat. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, pulled up the vendor contracts Kyle had steamrolled through, and began drafting a new timeline. Because this wasn't revenge. This was architecture. A careful demolition of a man who thought rules were optional and I was just a speed bump. They called it a closed strategic session, but everyone in that building knew what it really was. A panic meeting. No agenda, no minutes, no catered lunch, which for our board was like holding mass without wine. Just 7 silent directors, outside counsel dialing in with grim voices, and a stack of paper 2 inches thick labeled Risk Profile Immediate Exposure. Kyle wasn't invited. That alone set off alarm bells across the company. He found out when his badge wouldn't open the 17th floor elevator, stormed down to legal like a child locked out of his own birthday party, demanding answers. No one gave him any. Rachel had retreated into convenient vacation. HR was suddenly unavailable. Even his executive assistant called in sick. Upstairs, the storm was forming quietly. The board's outside counsel began her presentation with a deep breath and no pleasantries. We've received a pre-litigation notification from Warren Pierce. The central issue is Clause 12B of his employment agreement. Board members flipped to the highlighted section. Most had never read past the standard boilerplate, but 12B wasn't standard anything. In the event of involuntary termination following a documented compliance-related escalation, she read aloud, the company shall indemnify the employee for all legal expenses incurred in defense and counteraction, inclusive of damages, with no financial cap, time limit, or exemption of liability. She let that sink in. This clause was drafted internally by Pierce himself at the request of our former general counsel. It was reviewed by prior outside counsel and incorporated into 5 NDAS for staff considered mission-critical to compliance infrastructure. The CFO cleared his throat. What's our exposure here? Unlimited, came the reply. Financially, reputationally, legally. Pierce has 16 years of documentation. His termination occurred immediately after a protected compliance escalation. The executive responsible had full access to both Pierce's NDA and his escalation memos. There's no plausible deniability. What about settlement? The chairman asked. We tried. Pierce ignored our offer completely. He's filed preliminary complaints with both the SEC and state regulators. His employment attorney has a reputation for taking these cases to federal court. The room went silent. In corporate boardrooms, silence means one thing. Someone's head is about to roll. One director finally spoke. What's Brennan's status? Suspended pending review, counsel replied. But given the liability exposure and regulatory interest, we need to consider immediate termination for cause. Down in his office, Kyle was pacing like a tiger in a glass cage, still thinking this was about ego, about politics, about a disgruntled staffer too scared to fight. He didn't know they'd just reviewed a clause he'd signed off on, thinking it was standard NDA boilerplate. Didn't know the indemnity meant I could sue them into bankruptcy on their own dime. Didn't know the board now saw him less like a visionary and more like an active volcano. No one yelled, no one cried. But in that quiet, carpeted room with its leather chairs and filtered water, something changed. They realized they hadn't just fired a contracts manager. They'd lit a fuse, and now they were hearing the first hiss of flame. It came in a cream envelope delivered by courier, like a wedding invitation from someone who hopes you forgot they stole your dog. A letter offering me a generous consulting severance package, 3 months of pay, a signed NDA, and a promise to explore future collaboration opportunities if I'd just agree to move on quietly. They even had the nerve to call it a gift. Patricia read it over, chuckled once, and slid it back across the table like it was covered in bed bugs. They still don't get it, she said. This isn't a negotiation. It's a funeral. They just haven't picked the casket yet. I declined. No drama, no counter, no angry reply. I simply ignored it. Instead, I compiled one final document, the memo. I took my original termination notice, highlighted the timeline of events, attached the flagged contract, my escalation emails, the cease and desist, and the 12B clause. Then I added a cover sheet, submitted in good faith under federal and state compliance protections. For review. I didn't even sign my name at the bottom. I let the facts do the talking. Then I hit send. One email to the SEC, one to the state's Office of Financial Regulation, and one to Greg, my auditor contact, who replied 2 hours later with, "Holy hell, buckle up." Back at TechFlow, legal initiated what they called a comprehensive compliance review, corporate speak for find out how bad this really is. Behind closed doors, it was a full forensic audit. They reopened every vendor agreement Kyle had pushed through, subpoenaed internal communications, and interviewed sales staff about fast-tracked approvals. The results were devastating. Kyle had bypassed legal review on 14 separate contracts worth over $40 million. 3 contained SEC disclosure violations, Two had NDA conflicts with existing partnerships. One vendor agreement essentially gave away intellectual property rights that would have taken years to recover. Word spread fast in the tight corporate community. New deal flow froze. Clients sent nervous emails about governance concerns. One enterprise partner delayed a $12 million renewal pending clarity on internal processes. Another pulled out entirely, citing regulatory uncertainty. The stock price dropped 8% in 2 days. Industry blogs started asking questions. The SEC's enforcement division sent a formal inquiry letter. Kyle, meanwhile, was still trying to play it off as a temporary misunderstanding. He showed up to meetings he wasn't invited to, sent emails that nobody answered, and told anyone who'd listen that this was just legacy employees resisting innovation. But his badge had already been deactivated. His corporate accounts were frozen. Security was under orders to escort him out if he tried to access the 17th floor. And me? I didn't show up. I didn't call anyone. I didn't post a LinkedIn essay about resilience or finding new beginnings. I just brewed coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the cracks spread. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was what it feels like when the house you built starts pushing back. It hit the wire on a Monday morning, time to destroy the week before it started. No beeline, no direct quotes, just a surgical expose published by an industry outlet known for burying companies in polite, devastating prose. Headline: COO pushes through risky contracts, legal retaliation ensues. The article read like it was written by someone with a direct line to my email archive, which of course it wasn't. I'd never spoken to a reporter, didn't have to. The evidence had legs. Someone somewhere in the regulatory ecosystem, maybe Greg, maybe someone in the compliance office tired of covering for cowboys, had decided it was time for sunlight. The piece outlined everything with brutal elegance, a pattern of reckless vendor contracts signed without full legal review, an internal whistleblower raising red flags, then mysteriously terminated, a previously unseen indemnity clause triggering massive internal liability. Regulatory interests now formally engaged, per unnamed sources. They didn't use my name. They didn't need to. Inside the office, panic bloomed like mold in a damp basement. Teams canceled meetings. Executives stopped replying to emails. Legal locked down internal document access for containment purposes. Sales went full mute. And then the domino fell. A respected compliance watchdog, one of those slow-moving, methodical groups whose opinion carries the weight of a Supreme Court ruling in the corporate world, issued a rare public bulletin. A dry, heavily footnoted case study titled Retaliation, Red Flags, and the Cost of Ignoring Internal Compliance. Page 2. This case sets a precedent for how termination following documented compliance escalation may trigger binding indemnity clauses and potential SEC exposure. There it was in ink in the public record. Not just validation, canonization. The board met again 72 hours later. This time, the vote was unanimous. Kyle Brennan is terminated for cause effective immediately, the chairman announced. No severance, no vesting, no references. Kyle found out when his badge wouldn't work at the front entrance. Security was waiting with a box containing his personal items and a formal termination letter. Witnesses said he stood there for a full minute, holding the letter like it was written in a foreign language. The industry response was swift and brutal. TechCrunch ran a story titled, When Startup Speed Meets Corporate Compliance, a Case Study. The Harvard Business Review published an analysis of the hidden costs of bypassing legal review. Employment law blogs cited the case as precedent for indemnity clause enforcement. A respected compliance watchdog issued a bulletin. This case demonstrates how termination following documented compliance escalation may trigger binding indemnity clauses and potential SEC exposure. Companies should review employment agreements for similar provisions and ensure executives understand the financial implications of retaliating against internal whistleblowers. My name wasn't mentioned in any of the coverage. It didn't need to be. 3 months later, TechFlow settled with me for an undisclosed amount. The settlement included full legal fee reimbursement, a statement clearing my professional reputation, and a recommendation letter signed by the entire board. Kyle, meanwhile, was quietly blacklisted from every major tech firm on the West Coast. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just updated my LinkedIn profile and started fielding calls from headhunters who'd heard about the contract architect who'd built the perfect legal trap. 16 years of reading fine print had taught me something Kyle never learned. In corporate America, the house always wins, especially when you built it yourself.